The early morning sun bathed our quiet suburban cul-de-sac in gold, but the peace was shattered by the screech of Karen's voice echoing across my front yard. Officers, I demand you do something. That woman is refusing to comply with the HOA charter. She is disrupting the harmony of this community. Her orange blazer flared like a warning signal as she marched back and forth, fingers jabbing at the porch where my wife sat, calmly sipping her coffee. Two uniformed officers stood at the base of our driveway, their expressions caught somewhere between annoyance and uncertainty. I stood behind the screen door, frozen, watching what felt like the beginning of a neighborhood war. Karen had always been nosy, but this time she had escalated things beyond absurd. She'd actually called the cops to force my wife to attend an HOA meeting. That's right, not for a crime, not even for a code violation, but because my wife refused to sign up for her petty little kingdom of rules. The police hesitated, clearly unsure whether to treat this as a civil dispute or a real call for action. That's when my wife stood up. Calm, graceful, and in control, she set her cup down and walked toward the officers like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "Good morning, officers. May I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. One of the officers stepped forward, awkwardly holding out his hand. "Ma'am, we were told there was a refusal to comply with local ordinances," but before he could finish, my wife reached into her bag and pulled out a badge, sleek, black, and official. The moment they saw it, both officers immediately stood at attention and saluted. Karen blinked. "What is this? What are you doing? She's the one breaking the law." The lead officer didn't even look at her. He just said, "Ma'am, we deeply apologize. We didn't realize who you were." My wife smiled, cool as ever. "You just tried to bully the woman who signs your checks." Karen stumbled back, her mouth open, no words coming out. And just like that, the entire street went silent. We'd only moved into the neighborhood 2 months ago, just far enough from the city to get some quiet, but close enough for my wife to make it to work without much trouble. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet life, a peaceful home. Our craftsman-style house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac framed by cherry blossom trees and identical mailboxes, the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect on a postcard. But perfection is a lie when people like Karen are in charge of it. She'd shown up the first weekend we moved in, all smiles and sugary threats. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she'd said, handing us a packet nearly 3 inches thick. "These are our HOA guidelines. Attendance at monthly meetings is mandatory, and we do expect all landscaping to match the community standard." My wife had thanked her politely and then placed the packet in the drawer. We hadn't moved to be micromanaged by a retired real estate agent with a clipboard and a power complex. Karen didn't take the hint. She kept coming back, bringing welcome muffins one day, a printed-out citation for unauthorized decorative lighting the next. She made subtle comments about how my wife never joined the women's club, how our flower beds weren't HOA approved, how we parked one tire half an inch over the driveway line. And every time, my wife just smiled and nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She didn't explain anything. But I knew that behind that smile, something was simmering. I asked her once why she wouldn't just tell Karen what she did for a living. My wife just looked at me and said, "Power doesn't need to announce itself." She never liked showing off, even though she held a position most people would kill for. She just wanted to be treated like a regular neighbor, nothing more, nothing less. But Karen wasn't the kind to let things go. The idea that someone could ignore her authority, that was gasoline on a flame. When my wife missed 3 HOA meetings in a row and didn't pay the so-called voluntary dues, Karen declared it a violation. She threatened us with fines. She left notices on our door. And when that didn't work, she took it a step further. She called the cops. The morning Karen brought the police to our front yard wasn't entirely unexpected. Not after weeks of escalating passive-aggressive warfare. But it still sent a jolt through me, like we'd officially crossed from absurdity into outright hostility. I had just stepped onto the porch with a fresh cup of coffee when I saw the patrol car creeping around the corner, slowly pulling into our cul-de-sac. And there she was, Karen, standing in her yard with a clipboard, tapping her foot like a parking enforcement officer about to pounce. I watched as she waved them down with wild urgency, pointing furiously toward our house. They parked halfway up the driveway. She met them before they could even exit the car, practically shoving a manila folder into the officer's hands. "I've documented every single violation, officer," she said breathlessly. "The woman inside has repeatedly ignored the HOA charter, missed mandatory meetings, refused to comply with aesthetic regulations, and has not paid a cent in neighborhood dues. We've tried everything. Now, we need enforcement." The officers looked at each other, confused. One flipped open a file. "Ma'am, none of this appears to be actual law violations." Karen's voice climbed higher. "The HOA is a legally binding agreement. They're breaking the contract they signed when they bought the house." I stepped outside, trying to stay calm. "Good morning, officers. Is there a problem?" Before they could respond, my wife emerged from the house, her expression unreadable. She'd heard it all, of course. She'd heard it and waited, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted them to make the first move. She walked down the steps slowly, her heels clicking against the concrete like the ticking of a countdown. Karen's eyes gleamed. "Finally, maybe now you'll explain to the police why you think you're above the law." The officer looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic. "We were called here because of a neighborhood complaint. We just need to verify some things." My wife smiled faintly, reaching into her bag. "Then verify this." And that's when she pulled out the badge. The air changed in an instant, like a switch had been flipped. Both officers went still. One of them squinted at the ID, and the next second, they were standing at attention, back straight, eyes sharp. Karen blinked. "Wait, what is that?" My wife just said, "It's the reason you should have thought twice before trying to play pretend authority." The air was thick with tension as the officers studied the badge in my wife's hand. Neither said a word at first, but the atmosphere shifted instantly. The taller officer, whose demeanor had previously hovered between professional and indifferent, straightened his spine and saluted. The second followed, clearing his throat. "Director Caldwell," he said respectfully, nodding at my wife. "We weren't aware you were residing here. Had we known..." She raised a hand to stop him. "No need to explain. You were responding to a citizen call. You're doing your job." Her voice was calm, measured, and quietly authoritative. The kind of tone that didn't shout power, it carried it. Karen looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under her. "Director? Director of what?" she stammered, pointing between my wife and the officers. "What is this? Why are you saluting her?" The taller officer turned slowly toward Karen. "Ma'am, Director Caldwell is a senior official with the Federal Housing Oversight Division. She's our superior, not just ours, but every housing authority and municipal enforcement unit in a 5-state region." Karen's mouth fell open, her clipboard dropping to the ground with a soft clatter. "W what? That's impossible. She's not on any of our HOA records. She never filled out the registration form. She didn't even pay the dues." The shorter officer looked uncomfortable but firm. "Ma'am, her position supersedes all HOA authority. She is the regulator of HOAs. The rules you're trying to enforce? They fall under her jurisdiction." I could almost see the blood drain from Karen's face. My wife stepped forward, her tone still level but colder now. "You used scare tactics, lies, and threats. You filed false complaints. You tried to manipulate local enforcement into humiliating a federal officer in her own driveway." She tilted her head. "That's more than a neighbor dispute. That's abuse of process." Karen stumbled back a step. "I didn't know. You should have said something." "I don't owe you my resume," my wife replied, "but you just turned a neighborhood squabble into a federal matter." And with that, she looked toward the officers and simply said, "You, too, are dismissed." They nodded, saluted again, and got back into the patrol car, leaving Karen standing in our driveway, silent, pale, and completely rattled. As the patrol car rolled away, and Karen stumbled back toward her yard in a daze, I turned to my wife and asked the question that had probably been burning in every neighbor's mind. "Are you going to tell me what just happened?" She gave me a tired half smile, the kind she wore when the truth was heavier than it looked. I was trying to keep a low profile, she said simply, but that explanation only raised more questions. I followed her back into the house, where she finally set her bag and badge down on the kitchen counter like it weighed more than her shoulders could carry. "You remember when I left the agency last year?" she asked, her tone quieter now. I nodded slowly. "I didn't really leave," she continued. "I was promoted. The Federal Oversight Division needed someone to lead the new regulatory unit, the one auditing every HOA in the country. All the stories about abuse of power, illegal fines, harassment. Congress couldn't ignore it anymore. So they created the division. I oversee policy compliance, field investigations, and internal audits across 5 states. I report directly to Washington." I stared at her, stunned. You're the boss of the people who run the HOAs? "No," she corrected gently. "I'm the boss of the people who investigate the people who run the HOAs." Suddenly, all of her quiet restraint, her deliberate calm when Karen acted out, made perfect sense. She hadn't just been avoiding drama, she'd been watching, documenting, and waiting. "I didn't want to pull rank," she admitted. "I really wanted to just live in peace." But she forced my hand. My mind raced. All the warnings Karen had barked about, late fees, violations, even threats of liens, they were nothing compared to the actual authority sitting across from me in her casual weekend clothes. She could dismantle Karen's entire HOA with a single phone call. Outside the window, Karen was pacing, gesturing wildly on her phone, probably trying to call someone who'd back her up. She didn't realize yet that there was no one left to help her. She hadn't just messed with the wrong neighbor. She'd messed with the only person in the state who could shut her whole operation down. And my wife hadn't even started yet. You'd think, after being saluted by uniformed officers and publicly humiliated, Karen would back off. But if there's one thing we underestimated, it was her pride. Karen didn't just want control, she needed it like oxygen, and when she realized she'd lost it, something inside her snapped. Within 24 hours of the badge incident, she launched a full-scale counterattack. Flyers were taped to every mailbox on our street with bold black letters. "Who is this woman really? Is she even allowed to be here?" She posted in every neighborhood Facebook group she could find, accusing my wife of impersonating a federal agent, forging badges, and scamming the HOA to avoid paying dues. It was laughable, except some people started to believe her. Karen even printed fake violation slips and stuffed them in our mailbox. Unapproved lawn color. Unauthorized vehicle in driveway. Suspicious waste disposal. She was grasping at straws, hoping something, anything, would stick. Once, she even stood in our yard yelling into her phone, pretending to talk to a state inspector, claiming she had us under surveillance. My wife stayed calm through it all. She didn't argue, didn't respond, didn't explain herself. She just kept collecting. She had a folder growing thicker by the day, screenshots, printed posts, dates, times, photos of forged documents. Every lie Karen posted became another piece of evidence. Every fake violation added fuel to the fire Karen didn't even know she was building under herself. Still, I asked my wife, why not just shut it all down now? One call and she's done. She looked at me, eyes steady, because this isn't just about her anymore. It's about the way people like her operate, the fear they create, the lies they hide behind. I'm not just ending Karen, I'm making an example. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't revenge. It was justice. And Karen had no idea the storm that was coming. Over the next week, my wife worked like a surgeon preparing for a high-stakes operation, calm, focused, and meticulous. While Karen kept spiraling in public with her gossip and phony fines, my wife was orchestrating a quiet storm from behind the scenes. She began sending encrypted emails to her agency's legal division. Every screenshot Karen had posted, every fraudulent notice, every recording I had captured on our door camera, all compiled, labeled, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. I watched in awe as she built a case like it was second nature. She never raised her voice, never looked angry, But there was a certain cold precision in how she moved, like she'd flipped some internal switch from neighbor to federal investigator. She even pulled Karen's HOA filings from a national database and discovered discrepancies in dues reporting, improper elections, and unlicensed property enforcement. She's not just a busybody. My wife muttered one night. She's been illegally collecting thousands in fees from this neighborhood for years. No audits, no records, no legal authority. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Karen wasn't just annoying, she was a scammer running her own little fiefdom, and we just lit the match under it. Then my wife sent two formal letters, one to the HOA's Regional Legal Counsel, the second to Karen's Real Estate Certification Board, along with evidence of harassment, misuse of community resources, and impersonation of legal authority. Each letter was written in the kind of language that didn't scream. It warned, the kind of letter that makes lawyers stop in their tracks. Finally, she submitted a formal complaint to her own division, requesting an emergency federal audit of Karen's HOA. Her name was on the paperwork, but she'd be recusing herself from the investigation to keep it impartial. But that didn't matter, because she already knew what they'd find. It started with silence, the kind of silence that's too quiet, too still. Karen wasn't outside for 2 days straight. No notes, no flyers, no surprise visits, just silence. Then, on the third morning, 3 black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood at dawn. Not police, not city inspectors. These vehicles had no markings, just federal plates and tinted windows. Karen came running out in her robe, half asleep and confused, demanding to know what was happening. But no one spoke to her. They didn't need to. One of the agents walked up to her front door and taped a sealed federal audit order onto the HOA's community bulletin board, right in front of her flower display. By noon, the investigation was in full swing. Federal auditors combed through Karen's garage, which doubled as her self-declared HOA office. Laptops were seized. Bank records were copied. Boxes of handwritten receipts, many suspiciously lacking dates or signatures, were photographed and cataloged. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Phones recorded from cracked doorways. Whispers spread like wildfire. What did Karen do? I watched from our porch as Karen frantically tried to explain herself. This is some mistake. She's framing me. She never paid her dues. But no one responded. The agents didn't argue. They didn't need to. The documents were doing all the talking now. Hidden fees, missing funds, fake violation charges, years of unchecked power finally caught under a microscope. That afternoon, the HOA board president, Karen's best friend, Marlene, was served with a cease and desist order. Karen herself received notice of a pending federal fraud investigation and a subpoena to testify under oath about HOA practices. Her eyes darted toward our house as if searching for a lifeline, but none was coming. My wife never left the house. She didn't need to, because the system Karen abused was now collapsing around her. And this time, there was no one left for her to control. The downfall came faster than anyone expected. Once the federal audit was underway, everything unraveled like a loose thread being pulled from the edge of a cheap sweater. Karen tried to act defiant at first, refusing to turn over her laptop, yelling about property rights and illegal government overreach. But she didn't realize that the authority she'd mocked was now working with a magnifying glass over every detail of her HOA empire. Within 72 hours, the audit team confirmed what my wife had suspected. Karen had been running the HOA like a private business for over 5 years, illegally collecting fines, charging made-up fees, and pocketing improvement contributions that never made it to any official records. One by one, the documents spoke for themselves. Financial reports were falsified. Board meeting minutes were completely fabricated. Elections hadn't been held in years, and Karen had simply reappointed herself every cycle. She even forged neighbor signatures to approve policy changes, some from residents who'd moved away long ago, others who had passed away. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as agents returned to Karen's property with a court officer and 2 deputies. Her bank accounts were officially frozen pending criminal review, and her personal assets, including her brand new luxury SUV, were marked for seizure due to fraudulently obtained funds. The final blow came when her real estate license was revoked on the spot for ethical violations after the state board reviewed her harassment and impersonation behavior. Karen was forced to step down from the HOA, completely stripped of her self-made title, removed from any legal control. As she was escorted back into her house with a trembling hand and hollow eyes, the neighborhood finally exhaled. There were no cheers, no mocking, just silence. She had ruled the community with fear. But in the end, she lost everything, not because someone fought louder than her, but because someone fought smarter and in silence. And that someone was my wife. In the days that followed Karen's fall, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. For years, people had tiptoed around her, accepting the fines, the threats, the surveillance cameras pointed at their yards, too afraid to speak up, too tired to fight. But now that the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac had been dethroned, voices began to return. Neighbors who had barely made eye contact with us before now came over with warm smiles and quiet apologies. "I'm sorry we didn't say anything sooner," one woman told us, eyes filled with regret. "We were scared she'd fine us for talking to you." Another neighbor, an older man who'd once been fined $200 for painting his mailbox the wrong shade of beige, simply said, "Thank you." She ruled this place like a dictator. Even the HOA board, now free from Karen's manipulation, sent out a notice dissolving the existing structure. They requested federal assistance in forming a new, properly elected association with oversight and transparency, guidance my wife gladly offered without stepping into leadership herself. She didn't want control. She wanted accountability. What surprised me most was how quickly people embraced her, not as a powerful official, but as someone who had quietly defended them. Where Karen demanded loyalty through fear, my wife had earned respect through action. Children played on sidewalks again. Families decorated their yards with real freedom. Even the smallest things, wind chimes, garden gnomes, returned like tiny acts of rebellion against tyranny. The community wasn't just recovering. It was healing, and they all knew exactly who to thank. It wasn't until the story hit the evening news that the full scale of my wife's quiet power became clear to the public. A local reporter stood outside our neighborhood gates, speaking into the camera while the banner beneath her read, "HOA president under federal investigation, neighborhood saved by silent enforcer." They didn't even know her name yet. Just the title, Director of Federal Housing Oversight. The community buzzed with awe, not just because of what she had done, but how she had done it. No press conferences, no threats, no need for spectacle. Neighbors who once feared HOA fines now spoke her name like a secret blessing. Some called her the hammer wrapped in velvet. Others simply said, "She's the reason we can breathe again." One elderly resident left a handwritten card on our porch that said, "I didn't think people like her actually existed." I sat with her that night on the porch as the sun set behind our freshly repainted mailbox, a color Karen once banned. "You never told them who you were," I said. "You could have shut it all down with one sentence from the start." She smiled faintly, eyes watching the sky. "Power isn't about noise," she said. "Real power isn't visible until it has to be." She hadn't needed to yell, threaten, or posture. She had simply waited for the moment that mattered, and then she showed what power truly looked like: calm, precise, and impossible to stop. Karen had demanded respect and ruled by fear. But in the end, it was my wife who earned a salute, not just from officers in uniform, but from an entire neighborhood that finally saw the truth. 2 months later, the same garage where Karen once held her self-proclaimed HOA executive meetings was boarded up and locked. The fraud investigation had expanded beyond our street, pulling in bank records, years of hidden dues, and connections to other HOA abuses across the county. Karen's house was seized, her assets frozen, and her name added to a national registry of barred real estate professionals. But what came next was the real poetic justice. With help from my wife's federal office, the neighborhood elected a new HOA board, this time legally and transparently. The first thing they did? Dismantle the old office Karen had built for herself and convert it into something else entirely: a small community freedom center, a place where neighbors could meet, share ideas, and learn about their rights. A sign was placed out front at my wife's quiet suggestion. It read, "Authority without accountability is the fastest road to abuse." That sign still gives me chills every time I pass it. My wife never asked for recognition. She never gave interviews or accepted credit. She just returned to her daily work, managing oversight for thousands of HOAs across 5 states. But here on this street, people remembered not just what she did, but how she did it. One evening, as we walked down the newly painted sidewalk together, a little girl pointed and whispered to her mom, "That's the lady who stopped the mean woman." Her mom smiled. "No, sweetie. That's the lady who made sure no one like that can hurt us again." And as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I realized something. Karen had ruled through fear. But my wife? She had changed the neighborhood with justice